The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the steps of the Westfield Community Music School as Olivia Chen hurried inside, clutching her worn leather satchel against her chest. She was running late again. The old brick building welcomed her with familiar sounds, scales being practiced in upstairs rooms, the distant thump of a bass from the jazz studio, and the gentle hum of voices in the lobby. "Morning, sunshine," called Mrs. Wilson from the front desk, her silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Your first student canceled. Something about a dentist appointment." Olivia nodded gratefully. "Thanks for letting me know." The unexpected free hour was a gift. She could finally practice that tricky passage from Chopin she'd been struggling with for weeks. At 24, Olivia had already been teaching piano at Westfield for 3 years. The small school catered to everyone from eager 5-year-olds to retirees finally pursuing their musical dreams. Teaching came naturally to her. She had a way of connecting with students, of finding just the right words to help them understand a difficult concept or technique. But performing? That was a different story altogether. She made her way to practice room 3, her favorite. Unlike the others, it was tucked away at the end of a quiet hallway, with a window that overlooked the community garden. The room held a Yamaha upright that wasn't the newest piano in the school but had the warmest tone. Olivia set down her things and opened the window slightly, letting in the crisp October air. Taking a deep breath, she settled on the bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. A ritual she'd practiced since childhood. She began with simple exercises, warming up her fingers the way she taught her youngest students. The familiar routine calmed her racing thoughts. As she played, her mind drifted to the phone call she'd received from her mother last night. "Your father's recording is being featured in that new documentary about classical pianists," her mother had said, pride evident in her voice. "They're calling him one of the most influential pianists of his generation." Chen had been a legend in his time, a concert pianist whose recordings of Rachmaninoff were still considered definitive interpretations. Growing up as his daughter had meant a childhood filled with music, but also with expectation. Every time Olivia touched a piano key, she felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her fingers. She shifted from exercises to a simple piece she used with intermediate students, a gentle, Beethoven bagatelle that required more emotion than technical skill. As her fingers moved across the keys, she felt herself relaxing. Here, alone with the music, she could play without judgment, without comparison, without the crippling anxiety that had sabotaged every public performance she'd attempted since her disastrous recital at Juilliard 7 years ago. Lost in the music, she didn't notice the door opening slightly. Is this really what passes for piano instruction here? The voice, deep, accented, and unmistakably condescending, cut through her playing like a knife. Olivia's hands froze above the keys as she turned toward the door. The man standing there was tall and lean, with silver temples that contrasted with his otherwise dark hair. His clothes, a charcoal turtleneck and tailored slacks, screamed European sophistication. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, sharp and critical, taking in everything about her with a single glance. She recognized him immediately. Alexander Reed, the famous British-Hungarian pianist who'd recently joined Westfield as a visiting faculty member for the year. His recordings of Liszt had won multiple awards, and his master classes around the world always had waiting lists hundreds of names long. I was just warming up," Olivia stammered, suddenly aware of how simple the piece she'd been playing must seem to someone of his caliber. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "With children's exercises. I thought this was supposed to be a reputable institution." His laugh was soft but cutting. "I wonder what Hai Chen would think of his daughter playing such elementary pieces." The mention of her father's name felt like a physical blow. Of course he knew who she was. Everyone in the classical music world knew of Hai Chen's daughter, the promising, young pianist who'd had a breakdown during her first major recital and never performed publicly again. "These exercises are for my students," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I teach beginners and intermediate players." "Ah, a single syllable loaded with meaning." "So you've given up on actually playing then? How practical." The way he said practical made it sound like a personal failing. Before Olivia could respond, the school director appeared behind Alexander. Director Blackwell was a small woman with enormous energy, perpetually dressed in flowing artistic garments. Today it was a purple caftan with geometric patterns. "There you are, Alexander. I see you've met Olivia." She beamed, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Olivia is one of our most beloved teachers. The children adore her." "I'm sure they do," Alexander replied smoothly. "We were just discussing her teaching methods." Director Blackwell clapped her hands together. "Wonderful. Speaking of teaching, Alexander, we need to finalize your masterclass schedule. If you'll come with me to my office." He nodded, then turned back to Olivia. "A word of advice if you're going to bear the Chen name. You might want to aspire to more than teaching Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star to 5-year-olds. As they walked away, Olivia heard Director Blackwell chattering about the school's upcoming events. And of course there's the faculty showcase next month. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year. All our teachers perform. The community loves seeing the talent behind the teaching." Olivia's stomach dropped. The faculty showcase. She'd managed to avoid it for the past 2 years. The first year by being too new, the second by having a conveniently timed case of laryngitis that somehow affected her ability to play piano. But this year, Director Blackwell had made it clear that everyone was expected to participate. With shaking hands, Olivia closed the piano lid and gathered her things. The peaceful mood from earlier had evaporated. In its place was the familiar knot of anxiety that tightened in her chest whenever she thought about performing. In the staff room, she poured herself a cup of tea and tried to shake off the encounter. The room was empty except for Li Wei, the elderly violin teacher who had been at Westfield longer than anyone else. "You look troubled," he observed, looking up from his sheet music. His eyes, magnified behind thick glasses, were kind. "I just met the famous Alexander Reed," Olivia said, attempting a smile. "He caught me playing basic warm-ups and basically suggested I'm wasting my talent." Li Wei snorted. "That man has more skill than humility, but he doesn't know everything. He knows enough to make me feel like a fraud," Olivia admitted, sinking into a chair opposite him. "And now there's the showcase coming up. I don't think I can face it, especially with him watching and judging." "The showcase is about sharing music, not proving yourself," Li Wei said gently. "Your father understood that, you know. Behind all the fame and technique, he played because he loved the conversation between musician and audience." Olivia stared into her tea. "Did you know my father well? We played chamber music together occasionally years ago. Before his fame reached such heights." Li Wei smiled at the memory. "He would speak of you often, his little prodigy with the perfect pitch and the sensitive touch." The knot in Olivia's chest tightened further. Perfect pitch and sensitive touch. What good were those gifts if terror seized her every time she tried to share them with an audience? Later that afternoon, between students, Olivia slipped into the school's small library. Tucked among method books and sheet music was a shelf dedicated to recordings by notable alumni and faculty. Her father's recordings occupied nearly half a shelf. She ran her finger along their spines, remembering how he would play late into the night when she was a child, the music floating up the stairs to her bedroom like a lullaby. She selected one, his recording of Chopin's Nocturnes, and held it in her hands. The cover showed him at the piano, eyes closed, completely surrendered to the music. She had never achieved that state of perfect communion with a piece. Even before her anxiety had become unmanageable, she had always been too aware of herself, too concerned with technical perfection to lose herself entirely. "The great Hai Chen," came Alexander's voice from behind her, making her jump. One of the few pianists who truly understood the soul of Chopin. Olivia carefully returned the CD to its place. He was dedicated to his interpretation. More than dedicated, transcendent. Alexander moved closer, studying the collection of recordings. "I heard him play in London once when I was a student. After his Ballade No. 4, the audience didn't applaud for nearly 30 seconds, not out of disapproval, but because we were all still living in the world he had created with his playing. No one wanted to break the spell." He turned to look at her directly. "I've always wondered why his daughter disappeared from the concert stage before she truly began." The question hung in the air between them. Olivia felt her face grow hot with shame and anger. "Sometimes we find different paths to music than the ones expected of us," she finally said. Alexander's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Is that what you call it? A different path? Or is it hiding?" Before she could answer, her next student arrived, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with uncombed hair and untied shoelaces. "Miss Chen, I practiced the Mozart piece every day this week," the boy announced proudly. Olivia forced a smile, grateful for the interruption. "That's wonderful, Ben. Let's hear how it's coming along." As she led Ben to their teaching room, she felt Alexander's eyes following her. His words echoed in her mind. Is it hiding? The question followed her through the rest of her teaching day and into the evening as she sat alone in her small apartment. A cup of tea growing cold beside her as she stared at the upright piano in the corner, the one that had belonged to her father, the one he had given her when she'd been accepted to Juilliard. She hadn't played anything substantial on it in months. With a sudden resolve, she set down her mug and moved to the piano. From the bench compartment, she pulled out a leather-bound book of blank sheet music, its pages now filled with her own notations. The composition she'd been working on for years, her secret project. The piece that no one had ever heard in its entirety. Olivia opened to the middle section, where a particular passage had been giving her trouble. It centered around a single note, an E-flat that needed to resonate in exactly the right way with exactly the right touch. Her father had once told her that sometimes a single note, played with perfect intention, could contain an entire world of emotion. Her fingers hovered over the keys as Alexander's mocking laugh replayed in her mind. Then, pushing the memory away, she began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the music carried her forward. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been hiding. But as her fingers found that E-flat, holding it just so, letting it vibrate with something that felt like truth, she wondered if perhaps she had also been waiting, not just hiding, but preparing for the moment when she would finally be ready to be heard. The faculty lounge at Westfield hummed with excited chatter as Director Blackwell pinned the showcase assignment sheet to the bulletin board. Teachers clustered around, coffee cups in hand, eager to see their performance slots. "I've tried to create pairings that will highlight everyone's strengths," Director Blackwell announced, beaming at the assembled faculty. "Some of you will perform solo, others in duets or small ensembles." Olivia hung back, anxiety bubbling in her stomach. She'd spent the past week rehearsing a simple Debussy piece that she hoped would be unobtrusive enough to get through without drawing too much attention. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would invite comparison to her father. Just something quiet and competent that would fulfill her obligation. "And our special highlight this year," Director Blackwell continued, her voice rising with excitement, "will be a duet featuring our newest faculty member, Alexander Reed, paired with our very own Olivia Chen." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Olivia, who stood frozen by the coffee machine, the mug in her hand suddenly too heavy. She began, but couldn't find words to continue. From across the room, Alexander's expression shifted from surprise to poorly concealed displeasure. "Director Blackwell," he said smoothly, "while I appreciate the thought, I typically perform solo. Perhaps another arrangement would be more suitable." The director's smile didn't waver. "Nonsense. The daughter of Hai Chen and the great Alexander Reed. The community will be thrilled. It's exactly the kind of star power we need for the fundraiser." She clapped her hands together decisively. "You'll play the Rachmaninoff suite for 2 pianos. It's settled." Rachmaninoff, her father's specialty. Of course. Li caught Olivia's eye from across the room and gave her a sympathetic nod. The old violin teacher seemed to be the only one who understood the weight of what had just been placed on her shoulders. Alexander approached her as the meeting dispersed, his face a careful mask of professionalism. "We should schedule rehearsal times," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The suite is challenging. I assume you're familiar with it?" Olivia nodded stiffly. "I know it." What she didn't say was that she'd grown up hearing her father practice it countless times, that she'd fallen asleep to those notes floating up the stairs of their home, that she'd once dreamed of playing it herself on concert stages around the world. "Good. Tomorrow then, 4 o'clock in the recital hall." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Chen, try to bring your A-game. This isn't a student recital." The condescension in his voice sparked something unexpected in Olivia, not just anxiety, but a flicker of anger. Who was he to speak to her that way? She might have stage fright, but she was still a Chen. She still had the music in her blood. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The next afternoon, Olivia arrived at the recital hall 20 minutes early. The space was modest by professional standards, just 200 seats and a small stage with 2 grand pianos, but it was the jewel of Westfield Music School. Light streamed through high windows, illuminating the empty seats that would soon be filled with community members, donors, and local music lovers. Olivia set her sheet music on one of the pianos and ran through some warm-up exercises. Her fingers moved mechanically at first, then with growing fluidity as the familiar patterns calmed her nerves. She transitioned into the opening of the Rachmaninoff, testing how it felt under her fingers, how the piano responded to her touch. The music brought back memories, her father demonstrating passages, explaining the conversation between the 2 pianos, the way they had to breathe together like dance partners. Music is never just notes, he would say. It's what happens in the space between them. She was so absorbed in the memory that she didn't notice Alexander entering until he spoke. Your hand position is wrong for that passage. Olivia's fingers stumbled to a halt. Alexander stood at the edge of the stage, his coat draped over one arm, watching her with critical eyes. The Rachmaninoff requires more attack on those opening chords, he continued, setting down his things and joining her on stage. You're playing it like Debussy, all watercolor and no structure. I was just warming up, Olivia said, moving to make room for him at the second piano. Alexander took his seat and flexed his fingers. Let's start from the beginning. I'll take piano 1, of course he would. Piano 1 had the dominant role in the first movement. They began, and immediately Olivia felt the difference in their approaches. Alexander played with technical brilliance. Every note precisely placed, every dynamic shift executed with military precision. But there was something mechanical about it, something that reminded her of the criticism her father had once received from a reviewer. All technique and no heart. When they finished the first run-through, Alexander immediately launched into a critique. You're lagging in measures 40 through 53, and your crescendo in the development section isn't pronounced enough. The audience needs to feel the build. Maybe I'm interpreting it differently, Olivia suggested, trying to keep her voice neutral. Alexander's eyebrow arched. Different from the composer's intentions? Rachmaninoff was quite clear in his markings. My father always said that markings are just the composer's suggestion. The performer brings their own. Your father, Alexander interrupted, was Hai Chen. He had earned the right to his interpretations through decades of technical mastery. With all due respect, you are not your father. The words stung precisely because they echoed her own deepest insecurity. No, she was not her father. She would never be her father. So why was she even trying? They practiced for another hour, with Alexander stopping frequently to correct her tempo, her dynamics, her pedaling. By the end, Olivia's shoulders ached with tension and a headache pounded behind her eyes. Same time tomorrow, Alexander said as he gathered his things. It wasn't a question. The next 3 weeks followed the same pattern. Daily rehearsals that felt more like trials by fire. Alexander's criticisms were relentless, though occasionally interspersed with grudging acknowledgments when she executed a passage to his satisfaction. Better, he would say, as if the word cost him something. With each rehearsal, Olivia found herself retreating further into her shell. The confidence she felt when teaching her students or playing alone vanished under Alexander's critical gaze. The old anxiety, the one that had derailed her Juilliard recital, began to resurface. Her hands would shake before rehearsals. She started having the nightmare. Again, the one where she walked on stage and discovered she couldn't remember a single note after a particularly difficult session where she'd fumbled the same passage 3 times. Alexander let out an exasperated sigh. Perhaps we should simplify your part, he suggested. Director Blackwell wants us to play together, but there's no rule that says we have to play equal parts. Shame burned through Olivia. I can handle my part. Evidence suggests otherwise. He closed his sheet music with a decisive snap. Look, I understand that performance isn't your strength. There's no shame in admitting that you're better suited to teaching beginners. You don't know anything about me, Olivia said, her voice quiet but sharp. Alexander looked genuinely surprised at her pushback. I know that you're Hai Chen's daughter, with all the advantages that entails, and yet you're teaching hot cross buns to children instead of building a performance career. I know that you tense up every time we reach a technically demanding passage, and I know that you're letting your nerves sabotage what could be a decent musical interpretation. Olivia stood up abruptly, gathering her things. We're done for today. Running away doesn't solve anything, Alexander called after her as she headed for the door. Neither does being a jerk, she shot back, immediately regretting the childish retort. She spent that evening at home, sitting at her father's piano but not playing, just thinking. Alexander's words repeated in her mind. Running away doesn't solve anything. Wasn't that what she'd been doing since the Juilliard disaster? Running away from performing, from expectations, from her own potential? Her phone chimed with a text from Li Wei. Tea in the faculty lounge tomorrow before your rehearsal? I have something that might help. The next day, Olivia found the old violin teacher waiting with a steaming pot of jasmine tea and a small, worn book. My teacher gave this to me when I was struggling with performance anxiety as a young man, Li Wei explained, pushing the book across the table. It helped me then. Perhaps it will help you now. The book was titled, The Inner Game of Music. Its cover faded, its pages dog-eared from years of use. The problem isn't your playing, Li Wei said gently. It's the voice in your head that criticizes every note before you even play it. That voice sounds remarkably like our friend Alexander these days, I think. Olivia smiled weakly. He's not wrong, though. I do choke under pressure. Alexander Reed is a gifted pianist but a troubled teacher. He teaches as he was taught, through criticism and fear. But fear has never made anyone play better. Li Wei sipped his tea thoughtfully. Your father understood this, you know. He was demanding but never cruel. Did you know him well? Olivia asked, realizing she'd never really talked about her father with anyone at Westfield. Li Wei nodded. We toured together briefly in the early days. I remember when you were born. He was in Tokyo for a concert series. He called me at 3 a.m, not realizing the time difference, just to tell me he had a daughter. He was so excited he played Debussy's Clair de Lune over the phone for me, saying it was the first piece he would teach you. Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. Her father had died when she was 19, just months before her ill-fated Juilliard recital. Heart attack sudden and unexpected. She sometimes wondered if things would have been different if he'd been there that night, sitting in the audience, a steady presence to anchor her. I miss him, she said simply. He would be proud of you, Li Wei replied. Not because of who you perform for or where, but because you've kept music in your life, in your heart. That was what mattered most to him. Olivia left the conversation feeling lighter somehow. She tucked the book into her bag and headed to the recital hall for another rehearsal, determined to approach it differently. Alexander was already there, playing a complex Liszt piece that wasn't part of their program. His fingers flew over the keys with impressive speed and precision. Olivia paused in the doorway, listening. There was no denying his technical brilliance. But something was missing, that ineffable quality that separated competent playing from moving performance. He looked up, noticing her presence, and stopped abruptly. You're late. Only by 2 minutes, she replied, setting down her things. That was beautiful, by the way. The Liszt. Alexander seemed taken aback by the compliment. Thank you, he said stiffly. Shall we begin? As they played, Olivia tried something new. Instead of tensing up under Alexander's critical gaze, she closed her eyes during certain passages, focusing on the feeling of the music rather than the technical execution. She remembered her father's words. Let the music play you, not the other way around. When they finished the first movement, she braced herself for criticism. Your dynamics were better, Alexander said, sounding almost surprised. The build-up to the climax actually worked that time. It wasn't effusive praise by any means, but coming from Alexander it was practically a standing ovation. They continued, and with each movement Olivia felt something shifting. Not a dramatic transformation, but a small, interior change, like a door that had been stuck for years suddenly opening just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. The showcase was now just 1 week away. 3 days before the showcase, Olivia sat alone in the recital hall, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the empty seats. Their rehearsal had ended an hour ago, and Alexander had left immediately after, mentioning a phone call with his agent in London. For once he hadn't criticized her playing much. In fact, he'd been almost civil, nodding with something close to approval during the third movement. Olivia's hands moved to the keys again, but instead of the Rachmaninoff they'd been practicing, She began playing her own composition, the piece she'd been working on for years, the one no one had ever heard in its entirety. It had started as a simple melody that came to her the night after her father's funeral, a way to process grief too complex for words. Over time, it had evolved into something more structured yet still deeply personal. The piece centered around a recurring note, that E-flat that needed to be played with just the right touch to create the resonance she heard in her mind. It was technically simple but emotionally complex, building gradually toward a moment where that single note would stand alone, vibrating in the air like a question finally answered. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice the door at the back of the hall opening slightly. Alexander had forgotten his annotated score and returned to retrieve it. He paused at the sound of unfamiliar music, something haunting and original, something that made him stop and listen despite himself. He stood silently in the shadows at the back of the hall, watching Olivia play with an emotional openness he hadn't seen in their rehearsals. As she approached the central section of the piece, her body language changed. The tension that usually gripped her shoulders when she played the Rachmaninoff was gone. Her eyes were closed, her expression one of complete absorption. Her fingers found that E-flat and she held it, letting it resonate through the hall in a way that seemed to suspend time. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a reluctant recognition. There was something here, something genuine and unpolished and real, something he hadn't expected from Hai Chen's technically proficient but emotionally guarded daughter. The music built toward what seemed to be a climax, then unexpectedly softened, becoming more introspective. Alexander found himself leaning forward, waiting to hear where the piece would go next. But suddenly Olivia stopped, as if sensing she was no longer alone. Her head snapped up, her hands lifting from the keys. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. Alexander stepped forward into the light. "Not long," he lied. "I forgot my score." He gestured to the piano where his sheet music still lay. "What was that you were playing?" "I didn't recognize it." Olivia hesitated. "Just something I've been working on." "You composed it?" She nodded, closing the lid of the piano as if to protect the music from his judgment. Alexander walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing. "It's interesting," he said finally. "Unconventional structure, but there's something compelling about it. Especially that recurring E-flat." Surprise flickered across Olivia's face. "You noticed that?" "It would be hard not to. You play it differently each time, like it means something different in each context." He picked up his score from the second piano, tucking it into his leather portfolio. "Why haven't you mentioned that you compose?" Olivia shrugged, gathering her own things. "It never came up. Is there more to the piece?" It seemed to end rather abruptly. "There's more," she admitted, "but it's not finished yet. I'm still working on the final section." Alexander studied her with new interest. "You should finish it. It has potential." It wasn't exactly enthusiastic praise, but coming from Alexander it felt significant. Olivia nodded, unsure how to respond. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Alexander cleared his throat. "Well, I should go. That call with my agent." "Right," Olivia said, relieved by the return to their usual professional distance. "See you tomorrow." That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Alexander hearing her composition, about the grudging respect in his voice when he mentioned the E-flat. It was the first time he'd spoken to her as something approaching an equal. She got out of bed and went to her piano, playing softly with the mute pedal engaged so as not to disturb her neighbors. The piece flowed from her fingers more easily than it had in months, as if Alexander's unexpected validation had somehow freed something within it, or within her. Working until dawn, she finally completed the ending that had eluded her for so long. It wasn't flashy or technically demanding like a Rachmaninoff finale. Instead, it was quiet but resolute, building to a moment where that single E-flat would stand alone, unadorned, honest in its simplicity. The next morning, their second-to-last rehearsal before the showcase, Olivia arrived with dark circles under her eyes but a new sense of calm. Alexander was already there, playing a Bach prelude as a warm-up. "You look terrible," he observed as she set down her bag. "Thanks," she replied dryly. "I was up late, practicing the Rachmaninoff, I hope." She didn't answer, which he seemed to take as confirmation. They began their rehearsal and something had changed. Maybe it was hearing her composition, or maybe it was just the cumulative effect of weeks of practice, but Alexander was less critical today. When he did offer feedback, it was more constructive than condemning. The transition at measure 127, he said during a pause. You're rushing it slightly. Try thinking of it as a breath rather than a break. Olivia nodded and played the section again, focusing on that image. A breath, not a break. Yes, Alexander said, sounding almost pleased. Like that. By the end of the rehearsal, they were playing more cohesively than they had since they began. The two pianos conversed rather than competed, creating a dialogue that actually sounded musical rather than mechanical. As they were packing up, Alexander hesitated, then said, You've improved. Olivia looked up, surprised by the forthright compliment. Thank you. Your father would be... He stopped abruptly as if realizing he was crossing an unspoken boundary. You play the third movement quite well, he finished instead. The mention of her father hung in the air between them. Olivia found herself wanting to ask Alexander about his own background, about how he had become the kind of pianist who valued technical perfection above emotional connection. But the moment passed, and he left with a brief nod, their usual manner of parting. That evening, Olivia met Li Wei for dinner at a small restaurant near the school. The old violin teacher had become something of a mentor to her over the past few weeks, a gentle counterbalance to Alexander's harsh approach. So, Li Wei said as they waited for their food, tomorrow is the last rehearsal before the big night. How are you feeling? Olivia considered the question. Better than I expected, she admitted. Still nervous, but different somehow. Li Wei nodded as if he had expected this answer. And how are things with our demanding Mr. Reed? Complicated, Olivia said with a small laugh. He's still critical, but less mean about it. And yesterday he heard me playing my own composition. Li Wei's eyebrows rose. The one you've never let anyone hear? How did that happen? Olivia explained about Alexander coming back for his forgotten score. He actually said it had potential. High praise indeed coming from him, Li Wei said with a twinkle in his eye. And what about the ending you've been struggling with? Any progress? I finished it last night, she said, unable to keep a note of pride from her voice. It finally came together. That's wonderful, Li Wei said warmly. Will you play it for me sometime? Olivia hesitated. The piece still felt too personal, too revealing. Maybe after the showcase, she said. I need to focus on the Rachmaninoff right now. Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to other topics. Li Wei's upcoming retirement, the talented new cello student who had joined the school, the chamber music program they hoped to expand next year. It wasn't until they were sharing dessert that Li Wei returned to the subject of the showcase. You know, he said thoughtfully, performances like this aren't really about the audience or even the music itself. They're about the performer's relationship with the music. When that relationship is honest, the audience can feel it. Olivia considered his words. Her relationship with the Rachmaninoff was complicated. It was her father's music, not truly her own. She played it competently, but without the deep connection she felt to her own composition. What if the music doesn't feel like it belongs to me? She asked. Li Wei smiled. Then you find a way to make it yours. You find your own voice within it. The morning of their final rehearsal, Olivia woke early and went for a walk in the park near her apartment. The autumn air was crisp, the trees a blaze of red and gold. She thought about Li Wei's advice, finding her own voice within the Rachmaninoff. Maybe that was the problem all along. She'd been trying to play it like her father, or like she thought Alexander wanted her to play it. She hadn't considered what the music meant to her. When she arrived at the recital hall, Alexander was already there, just as he always was. But today, instead of playing, he was standing at the window, looking out at the garden behind the school. Morning, Olivia said, setting down her things. He turned, and she was surprised to see an unusual expression on his face, something almost vulnerable. I received some news this morning, he said. My former teacher, Professor Carls, passed away last night. I'm sorry, Olivia said, genuinely sympathetic. Were you close? Alexander's laugh was hollow, not in the way most people would define close, and he was demanding, brilliant but harsh. I studied with him for 8 years at the conservatory in Vienna. Olivia nodded, understanding more than she cared to admit about demanding teachers and their lasting impact. He never once told me I played well, Alexander continued, as if compelled to speak now that he had started. Not even after I won the international Tchaikovsky competition. He sent me a note that said, "Your cadenza in the Mozart was self-indulgent. Work on it." Olivia wasn't sure what to say. This glimpse into Alexander's past explained so much about his teaching style, about his relentless pursuit of technical perfection. "That must have been difficult," she offered finally. Alexander seemed to shake himself, as if suddenly aware of how much he had revealed. Yes, well, he was right about the cadenza. He moved to the piano. "Shall we begin? We only have today to finalize everything." They played through the entire suite without stopping, the longest uninterrupted run-through they had managed. When they finished, they both sat in silence for a moment. "It's coming together," Alexander said at last. Olivia nodded. "Yes. Tomorrow night will be fine," he added with what seemed like an attempt at encouragement. "You're prepared." "Thanks," Olivia said. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "I've been thinking about the second movement. The section from measures 89 to 124. I have a slightly different interpretation I'd like to try." Alexander's eyebrows rose. "Oh, it's more introspective than dramatic. I think it would provide a nice contrast to the intensity of the first movement." She expected resistance, but Alexander gestured for her to demonstrate. "Show me." Olivia played the passage, taking more time with certain phrases, softening others, finding moments to breathe between the notes in a way that made the music feel more conversational and less declarative. When she finished, Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "It's unorthodox," he said finally, "but interesting. Let's try it together." They played the section, and to Olivia's surprise, Alexander adapted to her interpretation, complimenting rather than fighting it. The result was more cohesive, more musical than their previous attempts. "I think it works," Alexander admitted when they finished. "It's not how Rachmaninoff is typically played, but—" He shrugged. Sometimes tradition needs to be challenged. It was as close to wholehearted approval as she was likely to get from him. Olivia smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you." As they packed up after the rehearsal, Olivia felt a strange mix of emotions. Nervousness about the performance tomorrow, yes, but also something else. A quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "See you tomorrow, then," Alexander said as they left the hall. "Try to get some rest." "You too," Olivia replied. "And Alexander?" He turned, his eyebrow raised in question. "I'm sorry about your teacher." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. That night, alone in her apartment, Olivia sat at her father's piano. Instead of practicing the Rachmaninoff again, she played her own composition from beginning to end, letting herself feel every note, every phrase. The piece was complete now, ready to be heard, but not yet. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow was about the Rachmaninoff, about playing with Alexander, about facing her fear of performing in public. And yet, as she closed the piano lid and prepared for bed, a new thought occurred to her, a possibility both terrifying and exhilarating. She pushed it away for now, but it lingered at the edges of her mind as she drifted off to sleep. The showcase was tomorrow, and she was as ready as she could be. The morning of the showcase arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that tapped against Olivia's bedroom window. She lay awake, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass, her mind already at the recital hall where, in just 10 hours, she would face her biggest fear. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Thinking of you today, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud. Call me after and tell me everything." Olivia set the phone down without replying. Her mother meant well, but the mention of her father only intensified the pressure she already felt. Would he really be proud? Or would he, like Alexander, find her interpretation unorthodox? She forced herself out of bed and through her morning routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast, though she could barely eat, her stomach knotted with anxiety. As she dressed, she caught sight of her father's old metronome on the bookshelf. He had given it to her when she was 7, teaching her about tempo and rhythm. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, running her thumb over the worn wood. "Music breathes," he used to tell her. "Never let the metronome become your master. It's just a guide." The memory brought an unexpected calm. Her father had been demanding, yes, but never cruel. He had wanted her to find joy in music, not just technical proficiency. With sudden decision, Olivia reached for her phone and called Li Wei. "I need your advice," she said when he answered. "About tonight." An hour later, she was sitting in Li Wei's small office at the school, a cup of green tea warming her hands. "So," the old violin teacher said, leaning back in his chair. "You're considering a rather dramatic change of plans." Olivia nodded. "It's probably crazy. Alexander will be furious." "Probably," Li Wei agreed with a small smile. "The question is, does that matter more than what you need to do for yourself?" Olivia stared into her tea. "We've worked so hard on the Rachmaninoff. It seems disrespectful to abandon it now. Is that what you'd be doing? Abandoning it? Or would you be making room for something else? Something that perhaps needs to be heard even more?" She considered his words. "I don't know if I'm brave enough." Li Wei's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Brave enough to play a piece you've written yourself that comes from your own heart? Or brave enough to face Alexander's reaction?" "Both," Olivia admitted with a weak laugh. "Here's what I know," Li Wei said, setting down his tea. "True music, the kind that moves people, comes from an honest place. Your father understood this. He played with technical brilliance, yes, but also with heart. That's what people remember about his performances, not just the notes, but the feeling behind them." Olivia thought about her father's recordings, about the way listeners would close their eyes when they heard him play, transported by something beyond mere technique. "I've made my decision," she said finally, "but I'll need your help." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Olivia practiced alone in one of the small studios, running through both the Rachmaninoff and her own composition, switching between them, making sure her fingers knew each piece by heart. At 5 o'clock, she received a text from Alexander. "Meeting with the director about tonight. See you backstage at 7. The showcase was scheduled to begin at 7:30. Faculty members would perform in the order listed in the program, with Olivia and Alexander's duet as the final piece, the highlight of the evening. At 6, Olivia went home to change. She had bought a new dress for the occasion, a simple, elegant black dress that made her feel more confident, more like the pianist she had once hoped to become. She styled her hair, applied minimal makeup, and stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the composed woman who looked back at her. "You can do this," she told her reflection. "Just play from your heart." She arrived at the school at 6:45 to find the parking lot already full. The showcase was the biggest event of Westfield's year, drawing not just students and their families but music lovers from across the community. As she entered through the side door, she could hear the buzz of conversation from the lobby where guests were gathering. Backstage, the other faculty members were warming up, checking their instruments, adjusting their concert attire. The flute teacher was doing breathing exercises in a corner. The cello instructor was carefully applying rosin to his bow. Everyone nodded to Olivia as she passed, some offering encouraging smiles or thumbs-up gestures. "There you are." Alexander's voice made her turn. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his hair neatly combed, looking every inch the world-class pianist he was. "Here I am," Olivia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been speaking with Director Blackwell," he said, leading her to a quieter corner. "She's especially excited about our piece. Apparently several local critics are in attendance tonight." Olivia's stomach dropped. "Critics? Nothing to worry about," Alexander said, misinterpreting her reaction. "The Rachmaninoff is coming along well. Just follow my lead and we'll be fine." This was her moment to tell him to explain her change of plans, but looking at his confident expression, the words stuck in her throat. "Alexander, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Westfield Music School's annual faculty showcase." Director Blackwell's voice boomed through the speakers, cutting off Olivia's confession. The audience applauded, and the evening's performances began. One by one, the faculty members took the stage. Li Wei played a haunting Paganini piece that drew enthusiastic applause. The jazz instructor and his trio performed a lively original composition. The voice teacher sang an aria that brought tears to many eyes. Backstage, Olivia paced, her heart racing. Alexander sat calmly in a chair, eyes closed, fingers moving slightly as he mentally rehearsed the Rachmaninoff. "You seem tense," he observed without opening his eyes. "Try some deep breathing." Olivia wanted to laugh at the inadequacy of deep breathing for what she was about to do. Instead, she stepped away, finding a quiet corner where she could center herself. Li Wei found her there 20 minutes later. "It's almost time," he said gently. "Are you ready?" She nodded, unable to speak. "I've spoken with the stage manager," he continued in a low voice. "Everything is arranged as you requested." "Thank you," Olivia whispered. Li Wei squeezed her shoulder. "Your father once told me that the greatest moments in music are when the performer disappears, and only the music remains. Tonight, just let the music speak through you." Before she could respond, the stage manager approached. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Reed, you're up in 5 minutes." Alexander joined them, rolling his shoulders to release tension. "Remember, we start together on my count," he reminded Olivia. "The tempo in the first movement is crucial." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The current performance ended and applause filled the hall. The stage manager gestured for them to take their positions. As they walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded Olivia. She blinked, and the audience came into focus, rows and rows of faces all watching expectantly. The 2 grand pianos stood center stage, their polished surfaces gleaming under the lights. Alexander moved confidently to piano 1, nodding to the audience as he took his seat. Olivia followed more slowly, her legs feeling like they might give way beneath her. Director Blackwell stepped up to the microphone at the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our final performance of the evening, it is my great pleasure to present 2 extraordinary pianists. Our distinguished visiting faculty member, the internationally acclaimed Alexander Reed, and our own talented Olivia Chen, daughter of the legendary Hai Chen, performing Rachmaninoff's Suite for 2 pianos." Enthusiastic applause filled the hall. Olivia caught sight of her mother in the 3rd row, beaming with pride. Next to her was an empty seat, her father's seat in Olivia's mind. Alexander positioned his hands above the keys, looking across at Olivia. She placed her hands on the keyboard, meeting his gaze. He gave a small nod. 1, 2, 3. But instead of joining him in the Rachmaninoff's powerful opening chords, Olivia's hands remained still. Alexander began playing alone, the familiar notes of the Rachmaninoff filling the hall. After a few measures, he realized she wasn't joining him. He faltered, glancing at her in confusion and growing irritation. The music stuttered to a halt. A murmur ran through the audience. "What are you doing?" Alexander hissed across the pianos. Olivia took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But I'm not going to play the Rachmaninoff tonight." Alexander's face darkened. "This is hardly the time for—" "Instead," Olivia continued, turning to address the audience directly, "I would like to play a piece I've written myself. It's called Echo." The audience stirred with interest. Director Blackwell, still at the side of the stage, looked bewildered but didn't intervene. Alexander stood up abruptly. "This is completely unprofessional," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You're right," Olivia agreed. "And I apologize, but this is something I need to do." She turned back to the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The opening notes of her composition filled the hall, soft, questioning, like the first raindrops before a storm. The melody was simple but haunting, building slowly as her confidence grew. She forgot about Alexander, still standing by his piano. She forgot about the audience, about the critics, about everything except the music flowing from her fingers. The piece told her story, her love of music, her relationship with her father, her struggle with fear, and finally, her journey toward finding her own voice. As she approached the central section, the part built around that special E-flat, she felt a strange calm descend over her. This was why she played. Not for approval or acclaim, but for this moment of perfect communion between herself and the music. Her fingers found the E-flat, that single, perfect note that seemed to contain all her joy and pain and hope. She held it, letting it resonate through the hall, vibrating with emotion and technical precision. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The entire hall went completely still. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a movement. As if everyone, the audience, the other faculty members watching from the wings, even Alexander, was collectively holding their breath, suspended in that single note that somehow contained multitudes. Time seemed to stop. The note hung in the air, a perfect moment of pure music. And then slowly Olivia continued, leading the audience through the piece's final section. the part she had only recently completed. It was a resolution but not an answer, an acceptance of questions that might never be fully resolved. As the final notes faded away, the hall remained in complete silence. Olivia sat motionless at the piano, eyes closed, heart pounding. Then from somewhere in the back, a single person began to applaud. Others joined, and suddenly the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes. Olivia opened her eyes, overwhelmed by the response. Her gaze found her mother, standing and applauding with tears streaming down her face. Then, almost against her will, she looked at Alexander. He stood exactly where she had left him, beside piano 1, but his expression had completely transformed. The anger was gone, replaced by something she had never seen on his face before, a look of genuine, unguarded wonder. As their eyes met across the pianos, he slowly, deliberately raised his hands and began to applaud. The reception area buzzed with excitement after the showcase ended. Faculty members mingled with audience members, accepting congratulations and discussing the performances. But most of the conversation centered around one topic: Olivia Chen's unexpected solo and that breathtaking moment when the entire hall had fallen under the spell of a single note. Olivia stood in a corner, feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Her mother had already hugged her tearfully, whispering, "Your father would have been so proud," before being pulled into conversation with some old friends. Now Olivia was surrounded by a small crowd of well-wishers, students, parents, community members, all eager to compliment her composition. "It was so moving," said one elderly woman, pressing Olivia's hand between her own. "I've never heard anything quite like it." That moment, that note, added a middle-aged man who introduced himself as a local music teacher. "How did you create that effect?" The resonance was extraordinary. Olivia smiled, still a bit dazed by the reception. "It's about finding the piano's sweet spot," she explained. "Every instrument has one, a place where the strings and wood and air all vibrate together perfectly. But it's also about intention, about putting your whole self into that single moment." As the crowd around her continued to grow, she caught sight of Director Blackwell speaking animatedly with a woman Olivia recognized as the music critic from the city newspaper. They both glanced her way, and the director gave an enthusiastic thumbs up. Across the room, Alexander stood alone, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, watching the scene unfold. His expression was unreadable from a distance. Olivia had expected him to confront her immediately after the performance, to berate her for the unprofessional change of program. But he had simply nodded to her backstage and walked away without a word. Now, as their eyes met across the crowded room, she felt a need to explain herself. Excusing herself from her admirers, she made her way toward him. "Alexander," she began as she approached, "I owe you an apology for tonight. Changing the program without warning was unprofessional and unfair to you." "I'm sorry." He studied her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly as if seeing her for the first time. "Yes, it was unprofessional," he agreed finally. "And in most circumstances, I would be furious." He paused, taking a sip of his water. "But it's difficult to maintain anger in the face of what you did on that stage." Olivia blinked, surprised by his response. "You're not mad?" "Oh, I was mad," he said with a dry laugh. "For about 30 seconds. And then," he gestured vaguely with his free hand, "then you played that note. That impossible note that somehow made the entire hall hold its breath." Olivia felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not just pride, but something deeper. Recognition. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your composition," Alexander continued, his voice taking on a more professional tone. "It has structural weaknesses, of course. The middle section meanders a bit, and the resolution could be more definitive, but—" He hesitated as if the next words were difficult for him. "But there's something authentic about it. Something true." Coming from Alexander, this was high praise indeed. "Would you be willing to hear my suggestions?" he asked, surprising her again. Not as criticism, but as professional feedback. "I think the piece has real potential." Before Olivia could respond, Li Wei appeared at her side, his face glowing with pride. "The star of the evening," he said warmly. "I knew you could do it." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You knew about this change of plans?" Li Wei's eyes twinkled mischievously. "I may have offered some encouragement and helped with some practical arrangements. Alexander shook his head, but there was a hint of amusement in his expression. Conspirators, both of you. Sometimes a student needs permission to follow their own path, Li said diplomatically. Especially when, it diverges from the teacher's expectations. An awkward silence fell between the three of them, broken when Director Blackwell hurried over, practically bubbling with excitement. Olivia, there you are, and Alexander, good. I've been looking for both of you. She clutched a glass of white wine that sloshed dangerously as she gestured. That was quite a surprise, changing the program, but what a result. Gretchen Walker from the Tribune wants to do a feature on you, Olivia. A feature? And she mentioned something about the Summer Music Festival. They're looking for original compositions, and she thinks yours would be perfect. Olivia felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Just a month ago, she had been quietly teaching beginners, hiding from any kind of spotlight. Now people were talking about features and festivals. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted. Nonsense, said Director Blackwell. After what you did tonight, you're more than ready. If I may, Alexander interjected, his tone measured. I think Olivia's piece could benefit from some refinement before being submitted to the festival. The core is exceptional, but there are technical aspects that could be strengthened. Director Blackwell looked disappointed. Oh, well, I suppose I would be willing to work with her on it, Alexander continued, surprising everyone, including himself, judging by his expression. If she's interested, of course. 3 pairs of eyes turned to Olivia, who felt suddenly put on the spot. Work with Alexander? The man who had dismissed her abilities, criticized her technique, and made her doubt herself at every turn. And yet, he had also been the first person to recognize something of value in her composition, even before tonight's performance. I'd like that, she heard herself say. Thank you. Director Blackwell clapped her hands together. Wonderful. I'll tell Gretchen you're polishing the piece for submission. This is so exciting. She hurried off to share the news with someone else, leaving the 3 musicians looking at each other. Well, said Li with a small smile, this has been quite an evening of surprises. If you'll excuse me, I believe I'll go get some of that excellent cake before it's all gone. He gave Olivia's arm a gentle squeeze as he left, a silent message of support. Alone again with Alexander, Olivia felt a return of the awkwardness between them. They had spent weeks rehearsing together, but always with the music as a buffer. Now, without the structure of practice or performance, she wasn't sure what to say to him. Alexander cleared his throat. Your father, he said abruptly. I met him once, after a concert in London, when I was still a student. There was a reception, and I managed to work up the courage to speak with him. Olivia felt a pang of longing for her father. What did he say? Alexander's mouth quirked into a half-smile. I asked him some technical question about his interpretation of a particular passage in the Rachmaninoff, trying to sound intelligent, And he said something that stayed with me. The notes are just the beginning. Music happens in the space between. Olivia caught her breath. It sounded exactly like her father, his philosophy of music distilled into a single sentence. I've spent 20 years focusing on the notes, Alexander continued, his voice softer now, perfecting them, polishing them. But tonight, when you played that E-flat, he shook his head, struggling to find the words. I heard what your father was talking about. The space between, the thing that can't be taught or practiced. Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you for telling me that. The evening wound down gradually. People began to leave, offering final congratulations as they headed out into the night. Olivia found herself yawning, the adrenaline of the performance finally wearing off. You should go home and rest, Alexander said, noticing her fatigue. It's been an eventful night, Olivia nodded. Yes, I should. She hesitated, then added, When would you like to start working on the piece? Next week, perhaps? Monday afternoon? That will give us both some time to decompress from tonight. Monday works for me. She gathered her things, suddenly eager for the quiet of her apartment, the chance to process everything that had happened. As she was about to leave, Alexander said, Olivia? She turned back. What you did tonight took courage. Real courage. Remember that feeling. It's what makes an artist. The words stayed with her as she drove home through the quiet streets. An artist. Not just a teacher, not just Hai Chen's daughter, but an artist in her own right. At home, she sat at her father's piano in the darkness of her living room, She didn't play. She just rested her hands on the cool keys, feeling the potential music beneath her fingertips. Tomorrow she would call her mother and have a proper conversation about the performance. Tomorrow she would think about revising her composition with Alexander's help, about the posse,